So how does the mind work? Today I want to discuss an aspect of the Buddhist Abhidhamma, which is the codification of the Dharma that happened after the Buddha's lifetime. This is an aspect of the Abhidhamma that I have not heard discussed before. I'd be interested if you have heard what I'm going to be discussing before. If you know of somewhere it's discussed, put it down in the comments below. But in any event, this is the issue about whether the mind works serially. That is to say, one thing at a time, in series, as opposed to in parallel. So I want to analyze this claim as one potential route towards an understanding of non-self, as well as some reasons why we might consider it potentially doubtful from a scientific perspective, but also from a meditative perspective. There are, of course, different interpretations here. None of these are going to be absolutely definitive, but anyway, something to think about. Now, as with the doctrine of momentariness that I discussed in a prior video, which I'll leave linked down below in the notes, we don't find this claim expressed in the suttas. We don't find the claim that there are discrete countable mind moments. We don't find that in the suttas. We also don't find the claim that the mind works serially, one thing at a time, stated as such in the suttas. In fact, we do find a couple of different places where this is sort of alluded to. In one place, it looks like the suttas are denying the claim that the mind works serially. It talks about the unrestrained mind being like 6 different animals tied together with a rope. Then those 6 animals with diverse territories and feeding grounds would each pull towards their own domain and territory. The snake would pull one way, thinking, "I'm going into an ant-hill." The crocodile would pull another way, thinking, "I'm going into the water." The bird would pull another way, thinking, "I'm flying into the sky." The dog would pull another way, thinking, "I'm going into the village." The jackal would pull another way, thinking, "I'm going into the charnel ground." The monkey would pull another way, thinking, "I'm going into the jungle." When those 6 animals became exhausted and worn out, the strongest of them would get their way, and they'd all have to submit to their control. So in this passage, each of these animals is a metaphor for one of our senses. What it's saying is that each of our senses is pulling us in a different direction. What we see is pulling us perhaps in one direction, what we hear is pulling us in a different direction, what we smell and taste and touch, and what we think about, these are all pulling us in different directions. And the strongest of these, the strongest sensation, is the one that will eventually precipitate an action. That's the one that we're going to go towards. And this metaphor of these different animals tied together, again, suggests that these are all working simultaneously, not that one is working after the other. It's not that there's only one thing at a time, but that these are all working at the same time. Now, to be fair, there are other examples in the suttas that suggest a different thing, that suggest that only one kind of event can occur in the mind at the same time. In particular, there's a relatively famous early passage that suggests that one can only have one sort of feeling at a time, a positive or a negative feeling at a time. There are these 3 feelings: pleasant, painful, and neutral. At a time when you feel a pleasant feeling, you don't feel a painful or neutral feeling. You only feel a pleasant feeling. At a time when you feel a painful feeling, you don't feel a pleasant or neutral feeling, you only feel a painful feeling. At a time when you feel a neutral feeling, you don't feel a pleasant or painful feeling, you only feel a neutral feeling. So it seems as though in order to properly feel pleasure or pain, we need to attend to it directly, that pleasures and pains demand our attention, and that attention indeed is kind of serial. We can only attend to one sort of thing at a time. I think this is less clear with neutral feelings, but it seems like the sort of thing that we can understand when it comes to pleasures and pains. But this doesn't necessarily require a doctrine of seriality, that is to say, a doctrine that only one thing at a time can occur in the mind, even though it does seem as though attention seems to be unitary at any time. Now, I asked Bhikkhu Bodhi, who was a great scholar and translator of the early material, including both the Suttas and the Abhidhamma, I asked him whether we could find a doctrine of seriality, this notion that only one thing can occur at a time in the mind, whether we found this doctrine explicitly stated in the Theravada Abhidhamma. And his point was that we could not find it explicitly stated, but that it was implicit. It was implicit. It was kind of like what we call a suppressed premise of the doctrine that we find in the Abhidhamma. I don't know whether it's ever explicitly stated in other Abhidhammas or other Abhidharmas in other Buddhist schools. That would be something to investigate. If any of you know the answer, let me know down in the comments. But in any event, what Bhikkhu Bodhi did say is that in the foundational book of the Abhidhamma Pitaka, the Dhamma Sangani, that is this foundational book in the Theravada Abhidhamma, it does begin by enumerating mental states and their associated mental factors. And for a Bhikkhu Bodhi, that implies, at least, that there can only be one of these mental states existent in the mind at a time. They're unitary. We couldn't expect there to be two mental states active at the same time in the same mind. Now, it's important to note here that we can all think of potential counter-arguments here. We can all think of, for example, states of mind that we might have during meditation, where we're in a pleasant state of mindfulness meditation, perhaps, but there's an annoying sound going on at the same time. Now, we might think to ourselves, well, therefore we can hold two things in mind at the same time. However, there is an analysis, an understanding of that kind of process that's given to us in the Abhidhamma. That is to say that there's a kind of an oscillation or flickering back and forth between two mental states very rapidly. We might say that in one mind moment, here we get to this concept of momentariness, which I think is very closely related to this doctrine that I'm calling the doctrine of seriality. In one mind moment, we're in a pleasant state of mindfulness meditation. In the next moment, which may be a millisecond afterwards or something, very short period of time, there is an annoying sound. And then we flicker back and forth between the annoying sound and the pleasant mindfulness. That's how these kinds of things these kinds of apparent dual states are analyzed in the Abhidhamma. Now we can sort of analogize this argument or this claim to what goes on in a computer, in a serial computer. Now we may know that the computers that we use every day are serial. They work one process at a time. And a perfect example of this involves the keyboard. Now we might think that in order for a computer to be aware of which keys we're typing on, it's got to be aware of each key on our keyboard simultaneously. But that's actually not how they work. They work serially. The computer is only aware of, or only takes data from one key at a time. But it does it so rapidly. In fact, most keyboards work approximately 1,000 times a second, a 1 millisecond scan time, that they can pass through every key quickly enough that we don't notice that they're only taking data from one key at a time. That's how a sort of a serial processor can appear to be working in parallel, or can appear to be doing more than one thing at a time, or be aware of more than one thing at a time. And indeed, as I mentioned in this earlier video about the doctrine of momentariness, there's a claim in the Buddhist commentaries that in the snap of a finger, many trillions of mental states arise and cease. This is a rather surprising claim, one that is difficult for us to really establish experimentally, but nevertheless, that gives us some idea that there's supposed to be a lot going on serially, one after the other, in a way that might appear to us that the mind is working at more than one thing at a time. So in any event, this appears to be the claim from the Abhidhamma. Now, contemporary science, contemporary brain science in particular, makes this kind of claim very unlikely. That is to say, the brain appears to be structured as a neural network. That is to say, it does not appear to be structured as a serial computer, but rather something that works massively in parallel. That is, brain science, and if we understand the mind to be very affected by what the brain does, the mind is extremely closely related to how the brain works, then we have to understand that perhaps the mind works in the same way. This contemporary brain science appears rather to be closer to the example we saw from the Suttas of the 6 animals tied together with the rope. The brain is always receiving information from all of the 6 senses, or the 5 senses plus the mind. They're all going on simultaneously. It's not the case that the brain or the mind is aware of one at a time, but rather they're all processed at the same time. And once again, we can think of examples such as driving while we're carrying on a conversation. There's a lot going on in the mind at the same time. We're paying attention to the road, we're paying attention at least at some level to the angle of the wheel, we're paying attention to our foot on the pedal, but we're also paying attention to the conversation that's going on sequentially, or at the same time, I should say, with the person next to us. Now, this can be analyzed, as I say, it can be analyzed sequentially in the way that it's done in the Abhidhamma. That is to say, we could perhaps understand the mind at one moment to be paying attention to the conversation, in the next split second paying attention to the road, in the next split second paying attention to the wheel, in the next split second paying attention to our foot on the pedal, and around and around. We can understand that this is a possibility, but it certainly isn't the way it seems to us at the time, and we don't need to understand it this way, especially given how we understand the brain to work. Now, it might indeed be that if we tried to focus our attention very carefully in a kind of a mindful way on what we're doing, our attention would indeed seem to flicker from one to the other. But that is to an extent an artificial construct of our attempting to pay attention to everything at the same time, which leads to this kind of flickering. Ordinarily, we're not paying attention in the same way to everything at the same time. Nevertheless, there's processing going on at different levels simultaneously. Now, in a recent video, I discussed the surprising example of split brain patients, people who had the corpus callosum, this middle part of their brain, split so that the left and the right hemispheres of their brain were operating independently. And I discussed in this video how experiments with such people led us to believe that these people did actually display 2 coincident consciousnesses at the same time, which at least seems to show that the brain is capable of having multiple coincident consciousnesses at the same time, even normally. Although clearly normally we're not in a split brain kind of situation, nevertheless the brain is at least capable of it. And this is one thing that I contemplate when doing mindfulness meditation. In particular, that one of the instructions that we're often given in mindfulness meditation is to count the breaths. Well, I've been counting the breaths for quite a while now, and what I find is that I can continue counting the breaths even while my mind is off daydreaming. The counting goes on, and yet I'm daydreaming at the same time. Now, once again, this can be interpreted as a kind of a flickering back and forth that the mind might do between counting the breaths and daydreaming, but that certainly is not how it appears to me when I am mindfully focusing on what's going on in my mind. which is to say, what appears to me is that I'm off daydreaming. And then I realize that I'm daydreaming, I bring myself back to, as it were, reality, to the present moment, and I find that my counting is continuing to go on. Well, that counting has to be going on somewhere. It's going on at some level. Perhaps there are indeed multiple coincident consciousnesses within me. I'm only aware of one of them, but there's another one going on, perhaps at a quote-unquote different level. If this is so, then it might be that attention is one thing, which we can only put at one place at a time, but that states of mind are something else. In other words, that we can have states of mind, perhaps even conscious states of mind, that we don't attend to. So I would ask us to consider the possibility that there are multiple coincident consciousnesses in our own, shall we say, brain or mind, if we consider that. The mind is whatever is associated with the brain that we have in our head, that we're not necessarily aware of, that they're coincident at the same time. They're going on perhaps at different levels. They may be aware of things that we're not necessarily aware of. This is another way that we can come at the Buddhist notion of non-self, sort of attempting to disintegrate this notion of the unitary consciousness that seems to be such a bedrock of many sort of different theories of the mind, but which I find in Buddhism is something that we try to look through, to see the way that the mind actually is constructed by the way that attention makes the world appear to us. If you want to know more about this, I did a recent video in which I indeed discussed this idea of these two brains, or two, shall we say, simultaneous minds in a split brain patient, in this notion of the vagueness of the self. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to have a refresher. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is actually linked here on the screen and down in the description below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.